Who was Alyce Thomas and why is he important?
R.S. Thomas was a priest, a political and environmental activist, a social critic, and, in my mind, the major post-war poet from Wales and one of the major English language poets of the 20th century. Why he's important, I guess that depends on who you ask. He's important for a lot of reasons, I think. In Wales, he's important not because he represents contemporary Wales, but because he irritates it. What I mean by that is he troubles the Welsh conscience. He accuses Wales of embracing a plastic culture and abandoning, selling off its most valuable natural and cultural resources, and including its language. I think outside of Wales, he's important because he's a voice for all threatened cultures and for exploited landscapes. He's also a poet of the big questions, struggling to find an authentic identity and a purpose within a world that he sees as having gone terribly wrong.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and also he's important because he demonstrates the difficulty, but also the possibility of spiritual belief in the 21st century, which in many ways is a secular century. And so I think for all of those reasons he's an important poet.
Yeah. So that almost asks the next question I was going to put, answers the next question I was going to pose, but maybe not. Who do you think is the greater Thomas, Dylan or R.S.?
Well, that's actually a really hard question to answer. I don't know that I could choose between them. If R.S. is the preeminent post-war talent from Wales, then Dylan was the preeminent talent of pre-World War II Wales. And this despite the fact that R.S. was actually a year older than Dylan Thomas, which a lot of people don't think about that because, you know, Dylan was something of a wunderkind, you know, and he died very young, and then R.S. Was a late bloomer, and he lived to a relatively old age. But and also they're very different in terms of both stylistically and culturally and politically. I mean, in some ways they couldn't be more different. But you know, Dylan was one of the first poets that I fell in love with when I was a student. I still have some of his poems committed to memory, and so I go to Dylan for just a sheer celebration of language, you know?
Yeah.
But, you know, I think it was Wynne Thomas who once said that R.S. Thomas is the Thomas for grown-ups. And I think as I've matured, you know, I started to read and do more of my academic work centered around R.S., but I don't necessarily think that he's better. I just think that he represents a different kind of vision.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. How did you get interested in R.S. Thomas's work?
Well, it just kind of happens, you know. I mean, it's hard to say. What interested me initially, but I can tell you when it happened. In 2000, I was in graduate school in Louisiana at a school called McNeese State, and I took a contemporary poetry class with a man called John Wood, who's a brilliant poet and also one of the foremost critics of contemporary photography. And one of the required texts in that course was a book called Poems of R.S. Thomas, published by the University of Arkansas Press. And I still remember quite vividly the experience I had when reading that volume. I understood the surface meaning quite clearly, you know. R.S. is not a poet that sends you running to the dictionary, at least not very often. But I always had the sensation that there was much more going on.
Yeah.
That there were kind of deep caves behind the words, you know, and that if I read them more, they would open up.
Yeah.
They would open up to me. And also there was all kinds of wordplay going on. There were puns everywhere, you know, and so I knew that the more I read, the more there would be multiple meanings and these creative ambiguities that would suggest themselves. And it was actually a deceptively simple poetry. It's very economic, very dense on the page, but also extremely complex in terms of form, you know? So I just really became fascinated with R.S. Thomas as a poet. I was there studying for a degree in creative writing. So it wasn't anything, I was very ignorant. I didn't know anything about Wales, except where it was, which is a little more than most of my students know. But I didn't know about R.S.'s status as a kind of icon in Wales, or the cultural position that he self-consciously took, or the way that other people had responded to him. I didn't know any of that. I just knew that he was doing something very impressive. And I mean that in the sense of like pressing itself upon the reader. Something he was doing on the page was making his work have an impact on me. And I wanted to know what that was. I wanted to understand it, as a writer. Like, how is he doing this? You know? And that just led to a master's thesis. And when that didn't satisfy me, I decided to do a PhD. But there was no one in the United States that could supervise a PhD on R.S. Thomas. Not really.
No.
So that's why I came to Wales.
Oh, all right. Interesting. Of R.S. Thomas, a stylistic biography, published by University of Wales Press in 2011. What aspects of Thomas's life and work do you find particularly fascinating?
Well, I think one thing that has always fascinated me is, how interesting he is as a craftsman. And I think that because he is such a well-known, iconic figure in Wales, there has been a tendency to ignore that aspect of his work. And so one thing that I've tried to do is to just look at the poetry and say, what is he doing in the poetry? And because I think it's a mistake to think of him as a kind of person who was out of touch with contemporary currents in writing. He has that reputation as the ogre of Wales, this reclusive hermit of the rocks who just kind of signed off, or did away with any kind of involvement in the contemporary world. And that's actually not accurate. I don't think that's right. He was very up on the work of his contemporaries. And his work, although it began in a very imitative way, he was kind of writing these sub-Georgian lyrics in the manner of F.T. Palgrave's Golden Treasury, the poems that he had studied in school. He very quickly changed. This had to do with a lot of things, I think. It had to do with the fear factor of World War II. Really pushed him towards a much more, I would say, modernist style. And also there was quite a significant influence from his wife, who was a well-known painter. She was in touch with contemporary art in a way that he wasn't. And I think more work needs to be done in that area of demonstrating just how impactful she was on his development. Damien Walford Davis has just edited Poems to Elsie, which are poems that R.S. wrote to his wife. And in his introduction, he deals with this a little bit. But I think there needs to be more work done in that area. And of course, R.S. Thomas wrote a lot of poems that were inspired by and commenting on paintings, these kind of ekphrastic exercises. That also has to do with the influence of his wife Elsie. So there's that, but he just kept moving forward. And this poet who began as an innocent plagiarist, that's what he calls himself in one of his poems, became an experimental poet who really pushed the boundaries of English prosody. In the introduction to the second edition of Paradise Lost, Milton had to explain himself to the editor, who wanted to know why it didn't rhyme. So there's this preface to Paradise Lost where Milton's explaining his sort of theory behind what he's doing. And he speaks of something he terms sense variously drawn out, where by not end-stopping the lines, by not rhyming the lines, he can do really interesting things with kind of infusing energy into all parts of the sentence, which may or may not correspond to the poetic line. And I think, poets of the 20th century and now the 21st have taken that further. Milton was still writing in blank verse. He was still, although he was doing really interesting things to it. But R.S. is really working with the line itself, where to break a line for maximum effect. Can I position these words with multiple meanings, these punning words at the beginning and ends of lines in order to achieve dramatic effect? And I think by doing that, he really becomes innovative because he tries to embody the postmodern world in every aspect. He has this very macroscopic look where he's looking into the cosmos. He writes a lot about satellites and astronauts and galaxies, and he has this very microscopic view where he's looking at atoms and germs and electrons, and all of this has to do with his own theology. He describes God in terms of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, like when you look and it's already gone, like an electron or something. And he's really the first poet who both in terms of form and content really pushes us into the modern age. I really think so. And I know a lot of other writers, of course, have tackled modernity, but in terms of poetry, I don't think there's been anyone else who's really tried to embody it in the actual formal structures the way that he has. And so someone who's looked at as kind of a backwoods recluse is actually this forward-thinking, progressive, experimental poet. And I wanted to talk about that. And I also wanted to ask, how did he get from A to Z? And so I looked along the way at who was he reading, who was influencing him, where was he living, what was he doing, what were the biographic circumstances. And so I came to think of what I was writing as a kind of biography. And so, but it wasn't necessarily a biography in the traditional sense.
Oh, right, yeah. Because, the subtitle suggests, stylistic biography suggests maybe a shift away from the postmodern suspicions regarding biographical criticism. But now you've described that the word biography perhaps means a different thing to you.
Well, I too am suspicious of biographical criticism in the sense that I don't like to read literature as a way of getting to know the writer. This is especially a problem with poetry, where it's often assumed that a first-person lyric poem is the voice of the poet. When of course we know that that's not the case. So I'm suspicious of it as well. In my book, I call this personality criticism, and people have been very guilty of this with R.S. Thomas criticism, because they see him in the image of the persona he created, the Welsh hill farmer, Iago Prydech, the mud-slogging, besmirched, stinky farmer type. They look at him as being like that. And it's just kind of carried on where most of, I won't say most, a lot of work has been in that vein, And so I wanted to say, okay, well, let's write a biography of a poet. In other words, let's look at how the poems themselves teach us about the tensions that are at work within him. I guess in a way I settled on the term stylistic biography because I think in some ways I'm writing a biography of the poems themselves rather than of a man. But I learned, I realized very early on that I couldn't write a kind of new critical formalist book, because for R.S. Thomas there's always a real close collaboration between prosody and place, style and situation. And he uses the metaphor of a geological crystal, which takes its shape uniquely depending on the environment that it's in. He calls it experience crystallizing within me, so that he says my verse is going to have the mark of the person who wrote it. And I think that's true of every writer, but maybe especially true of someone like R.S. Thomas, who was always sort of tortured by and conflicted by tension, different tensions.
Okay. That's been published in the journal, An Echo of an Echo, R.S. Thomas and Geoffrey Hill. The paper discusses the influence of R.S. Thomas on Geoffrey Hill. First of all, who is Geoffrey Hill?
Geoffrey Hill, who as of last year I believe is now Sir Geoffrey Hill, is a major contemporary poet. He's often described by critics as the greatest living English language poet. Harold Bloom, for example, is a real champion of his work, and other critics are as well. Peter MacDonald at Oxford. He's currently Oxford Professor of Poetry, which is arguably the most prestigious poetry appointment one can have. He's also had appointments in Leeds and Cambridge, and he spent many years in Boston in the United States. He's also an important critic who has written some very influential essays. One of his essays that comes to mind is called Poetry as Menace and Atonement, and it talks about two aspects of poetry. One, its ability to disrupt and be a menacing kind of presence, and the other, its ability to redeem. He has a line in one of his early poems called Genesis where he talks about poetry as something that ravages and redeems the world. And I think of Geoffrey Hill in that way, as poetry that's something that embodies the kind of destructive, violent world that we live in, and as such has to kind of violently impact the world, but at the same time through atonement, or what, kind of the etymological sense of that word, at one-ment, can in some ways bring through a formal representation the discord of the world into a kind of balance with art. So that's the redemptive quality of poetry, that it can somehow create some kind of harmony in a world that's incredibly disharmonious. I'm not sure that's even a word.
And the paper, obviously, you write about the echoes of R.S. Thomas poetry in Hill's work. What echoes are those?
Well, a lot of critics have looked at Hill's early work as being, incredibly original, and it is. In the early 1950s, Hill published his first pamphlet, the Fantasy Poets series at Oxford, and then in the late 1950s, I believe it was 1959, he published For the Unfallen, which was his first full collection. And, people just looked at this volume and they were wondering, where is this coming from? Is this Blake? Is this, some of the more Darwinian elements in Tennyson? Is this his American mentors like Alan Tate? Where is he getting this? And I think those are all good questions to ask, and I think it is an original book. But one thing that fascinates me is the similarities in the early work of R.S. Thomas, and I've always just seen them there. And I've always known that R.S. Thomas was a great admirer of Geoffrey Hill. He actually believed that, like Harold Bloom and others, that Hill was the greatest poet writing in English. And so I've always known that. But it wasn't until Hill wrote an essay for Damien Walford Davis's collection, Echoes to the Amen. Hill wrote a piece on R.S. Thomas. It wasn't then until all of these things started to come together in my mind. Because the way that Hill talks about R.S. Thomas is actually a lot of the ways that I think and other people think about Hill's work. Hill talks about them having a shared belief in original sin and how language itself embodies a fallen world. And so he talks about, he says that he and R.S. Thomas are writing with a keen sense of fellow feeling, and that they have a shared predicament as poets who are writing with a fallen language in a fallen world. And I started to realize that they had a lot in common. And I started talking to people about this, and it was Tony Brown a brilliant scholar who runs the R.S. Thomas Center at Bangor University. He said, well, we have a few letters from Geoffrey Hill to R.S. Thomas in the center, if you'd like to see them.
Ah.
And I said, well, yeah, of course I'd like to see them.
Yes.
And he showed me these letters, and what I learned from the letters is that a young Geoffrey Hill, while a student at Oxford in the early 1950s, discovered 2 books by R.S. Thomas and was so taken with them that he wrote a fan letter to R.S. Thomas. That's Hill's term. He calls it a fan letter.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for me to imagine Geoffrey Hill writing a fan letter to anybody. I mean, he has a reputation, much like R.S. Thomas, as this very stern, sort of imposing figure. And critics have not seen Hill as someone who was influenced very much by his contemporaries. And so that was really fascinating to me. And the way that Hill wrote in the letter about his exposure to Thomas's early work, he said, they became so much a part of my imaginative life that I had to write to you. And I thought, wait a minute, early 1950s, that is the exact same time when he's writing the first poems that he decided were even worth keeping. And they're the same poems in which I detected those similarities to early R.S. Thomas. So I started to just look through the poems with kind of R.S. Thomas on the brain, and there were some fascinating correspondences that suggested themselves. And it leads into this kind of reciprocal influence and response between the artists, I think in the case of Hill, it was really R.S. Thomas's early work that he responded to the most. I think in some ways he moved, he didn't really, he's not responding to the later work nearly as much. But in Thomas's case, he read Hill's work all throughout his life, mentioned it in interviews and letters, and it was tremendously important to him. And so I wanted to kind of write about not necessarily the influence of one on the other, but on this, what I see as a kind of mutual respect and admiration between 2 artists that continue to develop throughout their careers.
In this paper, obviously you're focusing on R.S.'s influence on Geoffrey Hill. Do you know of any other writers that he influenced directly?
Well, I don't know how you could be a writer in Wales and not be influenced by R.S. Thomas in some ways. Gwyneth Lewis has a recent piece about this in Poetry Review called Wrestling with Ronald. And it opens with this great line. She says, "We only quarrel with people who are important to us, and we make up with those who are essential." And I think, she talks about her own relationship with R.S. Thomas and how it's developed over time. And, whether a writer is responding to him or not, his presence kind of looms large over poetry, especially post-war poetry in Wales. But I'm actually particularly influenced in writers outside of Wales who respond to R.S. Thomas. At R.S.'s memorial service in Westminster Abbey, Seamus Heaney talked about how important R.S. Thomas's work was to him when he first started writing. It was enabling. It helped him to find a voice, and I don't think that's been talked about enough. And then, of course, Heaney won the Nobel Prize, and R.S. didn't, and so there's kind of this. And R.S. Was not a great fan of Heaney's work, and so maybe that's why people haven't talked about it. But I think there's more work that needs to be done there. There's this Nobel Prize winning writer from Japan, and his name is, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but Kenzaburo O. He has a novel called Somersault, and there's a chapter in that novel called Reading R.S. Thomas. And it's remarkable that this novelist from Japan, this brilliant writer is responding to the work of R.S. Thomas. That's fascinating to me. Where I live in the United States, which is a relatively rural area of Appalachia, there are 2 well-known Appalachian writers. One's called Ron Rash. He's a poet and a novelist. And one's called Morris Manning. They both have responded to R.S. Thomas's work. And we've had conversations about it, and how impactful it's been. And so I think, to me, it's really interesting to see the way that, writers who maybe don't grow up knowing anything about R.S. Thomas, who aren't exposed to him in school or in college, they just find his work, and it influences them for one reason or another. And it's interesting to me that it's rarely for the same reason. Maybe it's because of his early work, with the sort of rural landscapes or maybe it's because of his attention to spiritual and religious themes. It really, there's so much in R.S. Thomas to respond to.
Yeah, maybe the mark of a really great poet.
I think so.
What about influences on R.S. Thomas?
Well, he was pretty open about these. There's an early, one of the first books about R.S. Thomas was by John Powell Ward, and it's a wonderful book. But in the book, he makes the argument that R.S. Thomas covered his tracks with great skill. He had a lot of influences, but he covered his tracks, and I'm not sure that's right. I mean, he was very anxious, eager to talk about his influences sometimes. And in fact, when I was writing my book, that was very helpful to me. Of course, there's some influences I think that I didn't get directly from him, but he talked about a lot of them, and I should say too that I'm less interested in influence than I am in response to that influence. I like to think of it in terms of response, because we're all influenced, but how do we respond to what we read? And
we stick with your term echo.
Yeah, exactly. Early on, it was William Butler Yeats was a huge influence. Also, William Sharp, who went under the pen name Fiona MacLeod. These were really important influences, these sort of Celtic romanticism, Celtic twilight stuff. But later on, Patrick Kavanagh, Austin Clarke, two poets from Ireland, were very influential. And then I talked about the Georgian influences early, Walter de la Mare, especially Edward Thomas. I think Edward Thomas, I spend, many, many pages in my book talking about Edward Thomas, actually, because it was Edward Thomas who gave R.S. a kind of model for a way to bridge his Georgian sensibility with a more modern aesthetic. And so that was really important. And then in the 1960s, actually as early as the 1950s, R.S. Thomas discovered American poetry. And I talked earlier about his work with the line, and a lot of his lineation, his experiments with line breaks and enjambment, he got that from his reading of American poetry. People like William Carlos Williams, the Confessionals. R.S. Thomas read Robert Lowell. He was being published in a journal called Critical Quarterly alongside these poets. And so he was reading their work. A lot of people attribute many of his stylistic changes to his reading of Ted Hughes, but in fact a lot of them predate the reading of Hughes. But Hughes was another important influence. And of course, Geoffrey Hill, who we've been talking about. I think, R.S. used a lot of poets as, I guess, kind of springboards, ways of he would respond to them and see where it led him. He says of Ted Hughes, he started me off on a new line. And I think that's important. Poets are always looking for that. And I don't think that idea of R.S. Thomas as someone who was trying to hide his influence is quite right. I think he was pretty open about it, actually. And I don't think that's wrong. It's not derivative. No. He's not plagiarizing. He's using these people as enabling influences, I think.
Now you write poetry yourself, don't you?
I do, yeah.
Do you find echoes of R.S. in your own work?
That's people have asked me that before, and the first impulse of any writer is to say, no, of course not. But then you read the work and you find it there. With anyone who has spent as much time reading R.S. Thomas as I have, and looking at those poems, scrutinizing those poems about how they work, I think it's impossible that I wouldn't have been influenced by him. But I think the influence is less in terms of subject matter than it is in terms of what I've learned from him about craft. Which, again, it's one of the ironies about R.S. Thomas is that he's often talked about, or in the 1970s especially, he was talked about as someone who was formerly lazy, somebody who had a kind of lackadaisical approach to form.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the more that I read him, the more I think is he may well be one of the most conscious craftsmen, of his age. Certainly, I think of the second flowering in Welsh poetry. I think he kind of stands head and shoulders above everyone else about with what he's doing in terms of pushing the boundaries of poetic form. And so I think I've learned a lot from him about what poetry can do, about what a line can do, and what it doesn't have to do. And there's so much I can respond to. In the early work, there's these very muscular, stress-heavy lines, accentual syllabic lines, and then he moves into a more accentual line, where he's putting together the accents of words with tangible elements from the landscape in order to give the poem a very tactile feel. And so whenever I want to give a real tactile sensation, I think I learned a lot of that from him. It's not just from him. I learned that also from Dylan Thomas. I learned that from Gerard Manley Hopkins. But I think, he is an influence. And I think we share some sensibilities about the modern world, about contemporary culture and what it values and what it doesn't value. I consider myself to be a spiritual person. And so, R.S. Thomas was one of the great religious poets of the 20th century. And so that's somehow found its way into my consciousness. And I'm sure it comes out in the poetry. But I'll leave that to other people to say. I don't want to think about it too much, Alyce.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to me.
It was my pleasure. I really enjoyed that.